Okay, hello, everybody. This is a full-fledged domestic violence InfoNet training. We're going to go through all of data entry today, and we're going to spend some time tomorrow on reports and some other things I know many of you are curious about, including the data exchange service. We'll provide a high-level overview of that. But before we get into any of that, I like to start out with InfoNet's story because I think it's really helpful to not only understand how to enter the data and how to look at the data and how to interpret it in the best way possible, but why are we doing this? Why does InfoNet exist? How was it created? And I think I'm a little biased, obviously, but I think it's a really cool story that I want to share with you all. Um, so InfoNet is actually, well, what is it? It is a web-based data system that's used by victim service providers in Illinois. The domestic violence programs or providers are the largest group, but it's also used by all of the Illinois Coalition Against Sexual Assaults, 31 or 32 rape crisis centers, and it's also used by a handful of child advocacy centers. And their InfoNet interfaces look different, but there is a lot of overlap between those three different interfaces. And its use and requirements are collaboratively governed by ICEJA, both coalitions, and our partner funders. And by partner funders, I mean those who are administrating grants to various providers. And as a requirement for receiving those grants, you're mandated to enter your program or your funded data into InfoNet. So ICEJA supports the system, but it's collaboratively governed by ourselves as well as our funder partners. And InfoNet is actually 26 years old. It will be 27 on October 1st, 1997. That's when InfoNet was born. And the catalyst for InfoNet, it was an interesting time back in the mid to late 90s. The internet was very new. Databases in general were, I think, very new. And at that time, ICEJA has always received two federal grants. We receive other federal grants, but the two in particular are the Violence Against Women Act and the Violence or Victims of Crime Act, or VOCA. VOCA and VAWA, as you probably know them by. VAWA was relatively new at that time. It was first enacted in 1994. VOCA was a little older. That started in 1984. But in the mid 90s, I think that the government started being more aggressive with prosecuting white collar crime. And I think most of you may know this, but if not, I think it's interesting that VOCA dollars do not come from taxpayers. It comes from fines that are collected from people and organizations that are convicted in federal criminal court. So all the fines that these folks are ordered to pay as a result of being convicted of some type of crime go into a federal crime victims fund, and then those funds are then dispersed to the states and then eventually to victim service providers like yourself. Great concept. Have the people that have committed harm pay for services to help restore and heal. The challenge is you never knew how much you were getting every year. And at that time, I think our VOCA award was right around between 3 and 5 million a year. And in the mid to late 90s, again, the government started being more aggressive with prosecuting white collar crime among banks and corporations. And so our amount in VOCA tripled to nearly 20 million between 1996 and 1997. Again, VAWA was still relatively new, and we were administrating between 3 and 4 million from that grant. So the good news was we had a lot of extra resources to spend in Illinois on victim services, um, which is awesome. However, we wanted to make sure we spent that money in the most responsible way and target those funds where they were most needed and to fund programs that did good work. So our director at the time, this was another kind of contributing factor. Our executive director, her name was Candace Kane. She passed away about 5 years ago, but I call her the mother of InfoNet because this was all her idea. And she initiated a strategic plan to look at data to try and find out where, what was working well, where funds were most needed. And even though she was the director of our agency, her area of expertise so happened to be victim services and specifically domestic violence. So she had a special interest in making sure these funds were spent in the best possible way. So we were ordered to get data from all types of different sources, police data, court data. We requested data from folks like you about how many people were being served and basic demographics of those folks and what types of services were being provided. And you may guess what happened with the police or criminal justice system data. We didn't have much of anything because, as you know, most crimes never even make it to the criminal justice system with gender based violence. So we were only seeing the tip of the iceberg there. Um, we were very much helped with the data we received from the community-based providers, but the information and the data were collected so inconsistently, we couldn't really make anything meaningful with it statewide. So that's when Candace said, you know what, we don't really have much data to inform how these funds should best be spent. So let's build our own source. Let's build a database, and we'll build it together. So we partnered at first with the two coalitions. It made the most sense to start with those organizations because that's where the data were the most lacking. And we had already been strong partners with them in the first place. So we invited staff from those organizations as well as directors of their member programs. And they talked through, okay, what's this database going to look like? What kind of information is going to be collected? What does ICEJA need to report to our federal funders, the Office for Violence Against Women, as well as the Office for Victims of Crime? And what other data points do providers want InfoNet to collect that's going to be useful to them? So they worked through all of those questions together. And other problems that were going on at that time was providers had all these different funders to report to, and many of them were asking to report similar information, but in very different ways. And it was very tedious and added a lot of administrative burden for providers. So the overall purpose of InfoNet was one, to standardize data collection, make sure data were collected consistently throughout the state and that they meant the same thing to everybody. Establish a central repository for that victim service data, help ease the reporting burden for providers so they could use one system that met multiple funder requirements, and then also so that they had data to not just report to their funders, but that was also valuable to them. And that's kind of what I call InfoNet's utopia to this very day. That utopia is, we would hope that, now I know many of you are mandated by funders to enter your data into InfoNet, but we try to make it as valuable as we can to the point where even if you weren't mandated to use it, you would voluntarily choose to use it because you'd find it an investment of your time, because the data help you improve your work and you can use it as a valuable program management tool. So that was the most important purpose, is to help providers have a system where they could use the data, not just for reporting to funders, but that they found valuable for their internal decision making and planning. And a lot had to be talked through in this process. Not only did they have to decide what type of fields would be collected, they had to define and come up with standardized definitions. I can tell you that they met several times over coming up with the service categories and how to define those. It was interesting how differently, as easy as it may sound to describe crisis intervention, the variations in the definition or how people interpreted that service were a little different from provider to provider. They also had to talk through things like who's going to own the data, who's going to have access to it. Will funders be able to access with it and use it for whatever they want? That was a concern. So they had to talk through those issues. Client confidentiality, it was and still is a top concern. And then what the roles and responsibilities are going to be, who's going to do what. And so just an example, focusing on client confidentiality for the moment, this is why for your client IDs in InfoNet, you come up with the client ID number. Most providers use an alphanumeric identifier. The one rule that must be followed is that client ID cannot have anything that is linkable to the individual client. So for example, it shouldn't contain the client's initials, date of birth, partial social security number, anything like that. It must be a unique identifier with no information that's possibly linkable to the client. And you also will notice none of that information is entered into InfoNet. There's no names, no addresses. We don't even enter date of birth. You'll see we enter age at first contact instead. Another product that came out of these discussions early on were user agreements. Each of you has a user agreement with our agency. If you're new, you may not, and I'll be reaching out to you soon about that. But that specifies issues such as access and use and ownership. And those user agreements state that the providers that enter data into InfoNet, you all have exclusive ownership rights over that data. ICEJA owns InfoNet as the application, but you all own the data that you enter into it. And funders, including ICEJA, can only use it under very certain criteria. So funders, including our agency, we can only access for research and planning purposes or for grant monitoring purposes, aggregate data only. So number of people served by age group or by gender identity, but we do not have access to record level data such as client 123V was a 32-year-old African American female with 3 children. That type of record level data funders do not have access to. There is an exception at ICEJA. The InfoNet team that is charged with assisting you solving problems and helping you use InfoNet, we do have access to that level of information, but we're only allowed to use it in that capacity. We can't use it for research and planning without your permission. So sometimes we need to see exactly what you're seeing to help you solve whatever problem it is. But the grant monitors here at ICEJA do not have any of that same access. And the InfoNet team are not grant monitors. We do not make funding decisions. So that's how the roles are divided out. ICEJA can share InfoNet data with third parties, and we often do under only certain conditions. One, it must be in the aggregate, and it also must be aggregated among multiple organizations. So I make the minimum 3. So that means if the Chicago Tribune calls me and wants to know how many people were served or were provided with domestic violence services in the city of Chicago, I can provide them with that number because it combines 20 or 25 different organizations. If somebody asks me, how many clients were served by Family Rescue or one particular organization in Chicago, I cannot provide them that number without seeking your approval. So that's how the user agreements are set up. Other parties, including the general public, can request InfoNet data in the same way, but those conditions must be met. It must be aggregated and combined with multiple organizations of data. If anybody does want more detailed data at the organizational or the record level, they need to write a proposal. I have a template that folks use. They need to describe what they want to do with the data, exactly what data do they want, what the purpose of the data are, what the purpose of their study is, and they also need to list what the benefits will be to you all as providers. They send that to me. I share it with your directors, and if you are good with that approval, then you let me know and we share that data after we have that approval. So that's how you have ownership and control over your data. These are a list of our partner funders. So again, these are organizations that help share in InfoNet's supportive costs. The coalitions are not part of those, but the coalitions are administering ICEJA grant funds on our behalf. And then over 26 years, a lot has happened. We evolved over time based on changing data collection and reporting needs and feedback from you all. So I encourage you, if you have ideas for improving InfoNet, we want to hear those ideas. The more you use it, the more ideas you may have. So we encourage you to use the InfoNet help email to suggest improvements for us. So back when InfoNet was first created, it actually wasn't a web-based system. It was an access database that we shared or made copies of for all the providers. They would enter their data and they would email it to us weekly. And we'd back it up and keep it here. So in 2001, we were able to migrate to an internet-based system, which really helped with the technological burden and placed most of that responsibility on us. So that was a huge ease on providers. We try to build new reports whenever we hear the need for that throughout. We've added new data points based on new funder requirements and just new needs that you come up with that you think would be helpful in improving your work. Service outcomes were added in 2009. We added LGBTQ data points in 2015. We rebuilt the system in 2018, yielding InfoNet 2.0, added some race ethnicity categories in 2020. And the most recent is the InfoNet Stepping Forward project, which I will get into those upgrades a little later. And that gave birth to InfoNet 3.0. So it's changed a lot over the years, largely based on feedback from you all. So that's why it's so important for us to hear that feedback. Here are people that in organizations that use InfoNet. We're just over 100 community-based providers, although for those of you that are both domestic violence and sexual assault programs, you're counted in there twice. Some funders, organizations, and then about 1,800 individual people throughout the state are using InfoNet regularly. These are the most common uses by funder organizations. So we can report to the feds, do some grant monitoring by assessing program performance, looking at specific funding streams and making sure that those funds are being used for what they were targeted for, doing continuous strategic planning, and then helping to inform our funding priorities. Every 4 years, ICEJA does a victim services planning report where we look at multiple sources of data, including InfoNet, and then we use that data as well as feedback from the field to come up with funding priorities that inform how our victim service grant funding is to be prioritized for the next 4 years. And that report is available on our website if you're interested. How it's used by local providers, a lot of overlap here. This is hugely important. All the things we do at the state level with InfoNet data, you could do the same thing at the local level, but you could do it better because you're embedded in the community. You know those communities better than we ever could. We don't have that magnifying glass. You're also knowledgeable about other resources in the community that can be helpful for survivors. So we encourage you to use InfoNet data as well as other sources to do community needs assessment, try to identify service gaps in your area. It can be used for all these things. And I have seen amazing things done by you all with InfoNet data. One example I like to describe is one of the fields collected in InfoNet describes the type of housing folks are living in. And most, probably not surprising, of the survivors you serve are renting apartments. Many municipalities in Illinois and probably beyond have an ordinance called a crime-free ordinance. And this ordinance was probably created with good intentions. It gives landlords the ability to evict tenants when police have to go to that unit too often. But as many of you know, this unintentionally punishes survivors for calling the police. So a bunch of you got together and lobbied for change or removal of this legislation, and many of you were successful. And I don't believe this ordinance exists any longer in many municipalities, or if it does, it was substantially revised. So that is just one example of how you can use the data as well as your stories from the field and your expertise to really improve policy and practice, and in this case, legislation on survivors' behalf. And then others use InfoNet data as well. This is one great example. The network puts out this wonderful report called Measuring Safety, where they use multiple data sources, feedback from you all and the clients that you're serving, as well as data from InfoNet. So keep an eye out for that. I believe that is coming out in 2024 as well. And I think, taking too long on this section, but it's my favorite, so not surprising. But to wrap things up, this is a summary of what type of information is collected in InfoNet. This is kind of a high-level overview. There's basically 4 general categories: information about the clients or survivors, information about the people that commit the abuse, client interactions with healthcare and legal systems, and then the services and activities that you all do. And when something is bolded, that means it's, in most cases, I want to say maybe even 100%, is required by a funder to enter that information. The unbolded areas are, for the most part, optional. And these are the areas that were ideas from the providers. When we brought this group together back in the late 90s, we envisioned InfoNet as a much simpler system that it is today, basically collecting information about each survivor, demographics, and some socioeconomic information, and what services were being provided. But directors of providers at the table also wanted InfoNet to be used for a lot of these other things, which is why they exist today. And again, it's been around for 26, almost 27 years now. So over that time, there's over 1.25 million client records, 2 million hotline records or anonymous crisis intervention, 2.3 million services you provide to the community, things like presentations, institutional advocacy, and then nearly 24 million service contacts to the survivors. So you all have done a lot of work over this time. So at this point, I'm going to stop recording and take any questions.